Hello, I'm Rick Becker, host of the Irish Baseball Podcast, joined today by Clive Barnes. Clive, thank you so much for being here.
And thanks a lot for having me. I'm really excited about this, so it's great.
We are going to be talking about your book, The Year Grunge Broke. And I'm going to be a little bit honest. We're going to talk about grunge in general a lot for this episode. So, first of all, why don't you just give us a little description of your book, The Year Grunge Broke, and then we'll talk a little more about the subject overall.
So the Year Grunge Broke started for me as first of all, it was a band. It was a band that paid homage to that era of music, particularly the late 80s, early 90s. And then the social media site started gaining an awful lot of traction. I mean, a lot of traction, particularly on Facebook. And I would kind of do these stories and posts and things about the albums of that time. And before I knew it, over the pandemic, I began writing every anniversary that would happen for an album. I would write these pieces, and all of a sudden I noticed I had 20 of them, and then I had 30 of them, and then I had 50 of them, and then I had 80 of them, and then I went back and I kept rewriting them, and finding out more information and adding stuff, and all of a sudden I realized I basically have a book, and it was really that. I didn't begin writing a book; it just happened, So that's kind of how it came about. The book itself is 50 albums of grunge and alternative rock, which is basically the same thing. It's the concept of the year grunge broke is the year that grunge broke, which were, in my mind, the Seattle bands that tipped the alternative rock music culture worldwide into the mainstream. And even though it was bubbling under for a long time, it became mainstream around that time. And the book kind of delves into the story of those albums, how they were made, and some bands that you would know, some bands you might not know, and some bands, that are bubbling under.
So, alternative music as a genre sort of starts, I mean, this isn't an exact science, but it sort of starts with punk in the late 70s. And then you get into post punk and new wave. And then you start getting bands like REM, Husker Du, some of these more experimental bands, Midnight Oil from Australia. You get some of these bands that are hovering just below the surface. Maybe every once in a while, REM will pop up on the radio or Midnight Oil will have a hit, but it's bubbling under, and punk bands like Black Flag, things like that happening all throughout the 80s. But the mainstream of music at that time is really, really heavy into the hair metal, Motley Crue, and then it starts to get into Guns N' Roses. And right around the time of Guns N' Roses, that's when we also get these bands like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Alice in Chains. So, what would you consider, first of all, the start of alternative breaking? Would it be 1991 with Smells Like Teen Spirit? Or would some of those bands like REM, Midnight Oil, that were having hits in the mid to late 80s, would that be when you would consider alternative breaking?
So again, it's I suppose what's your idea of the word breaking? And I mean commercially breaking, it's really easy to pinpoint because it does come down to Smells Like Teen Spirit and Nirvana. It's that was the absolute tipping point. But it was, I say in the intro of the book, that was the accumulation of years, like you said, and very knowledgeable you are of those things that had come before. Um, they were building all the way through the 80s, bubbling under bands like Sonic Youth as well, hugely important to that scene. But I like to look into the very beginnings of all of these things, and I love that era. I love that 80s era when it comes out of punk, it starts, and then I made a point in the book as well in my introduction of saying that this was the last music scene that developed before the internet age. So bands developed in a very different way at that time because they didn't have the internet to kind of connect everybody so freely. So scenes happened a lot more, like the Seattle scene. There was the Minneapolis scene with Husker Du and the Replacements and different bands like that. The New York scene, all of those scenes in the US were really integral. And when they came together, it meant that the early 90s alternative rock explosion was incredibly diverse. It wasn't like homogenized, like, say, the rock scene where it was the glam scene, where everything sounded the same and looked the same. You got bands in the early 90s like Primus, who are uncategorizable. But people who listen to Nirvana listen to Primus. It seemed to be a fantastic time for just very eclectic music coming to the fore, and it was kind of exciting. But definitely the mainstream tipping point was September 1991. That's my thinking anyway.
I think we can all sort of pinpoint that as the eureka moment for alternative music. There were some things bubbling under, but then it hit and it was almost instantaneous, at least when you talk about MTV, that once Nirvana hit with Smells Like Teen Spirit, the world just changed immediately. Maybe on pop radio, it took a little longer. There's still a lot of Brian Adams and Phil
Yeah.
Collins in 1991 that's being played, John Cicada, stuff like that, that's still dominating the radio in 1991. But a lot of that stuff is gone by September of 1992 because of how big this explosion was, starting with, like you said, Smells Like Teen Spirit. Do you think that the grunge moment was almost inevitable because of how excessive things got in the 80s, how derivative songs got? By the time you started having songs like Cherry Pie and things like that were coming out, like it was obvious that something needed to change.
Absolutely. I mean, music has always gone in cycles. And particularly in that era, as I said, the pre-internet era, you can actually pinpoint certain time, frames of time, say years that this happened, this happened, this happened, and it was always in a cyclical kind of a thing. But yes, rock music in particular had become so. It was very like a band like Guns N' Roses is interesting. You made a very interesting point earlier about like '87 Guns N' Roses release Appetite for Destruction, and even though it wasn't really a hair metal album, and they just they looked a little different. They were a little more streetwise, right? And that kind of glam music scene could have went in that direction, and it didn't. It got worse. It pushed more. Even though the success of Guns N' Roses, nobody took notice of it, and everybody kept going in that kind of, very plastic kind of stylized. But it seems like the guys in the alternative rock scene were slightly more in tune with the Guns N' Roses aesthetic ish. And there's links there. I mean, look, Duff McKagan is from Seattle. He was in a band called 10 Minute Warning. He moved down to Los Angeles with his friend Greg Gilmore, who was in a band called Mother Love Bone, had Stone and Jeff from Pearl Jam. And, he ended up in Guns N' Roses. Greg Gilmore went home to Seattle. There's links everywhere with all of this stuff. But it's an interesting topic that why didn't the glam scene follow the Guns N' Roses route, which was more real, more realistic, which seems to be what people were craving for by 1991.
And it's not like the grunge movement was completely and totally separated from glam, because you do have, like you said, Duff, and I wouldn't really consider Guns N' Roses glam, but they were definitely in the hair metal genre.
Yes. Yeah, yeah.
Duff being from Seattle. And then you have like Mike McCready from Pearl Jam. He was in he went down to Los Angeles just like
Yeah,
Duff
he's
McKagan, and
gone.
he had Shadow,
Yeah,
which was kind of a
Shadow.
hair
Yeah,
metal band. When you talk about Mother Love Bone, that was more in line with Guns N' Roses and some of the
yeah,
hair metal stuff. And if you look at early Alice in Chains shows,
Yeah, dude.
They have the teased hair.
Yeah.
They're getting announced just like their Motley Crue. They're doing the whole thing. They're shredding just like so it's not like these bands. I think sometimes when we look back on it, you think, "Oh, Alice in Chains, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, these guys were like real and they didn't care
Yeah.
about success." But there were points in the late 80s where they were chasing the same things. We're just lucky enough, or they're just lucky enough that we didn't see that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's the latter. I mean, it's all come out now, but back in the day when they were coming up, we just thought these people landed and they were like, yeah. But they had. You're so right. And I mean, there seems to be a fissure in the Seattle music scene if you want to just make that a microcosm of the whole alternative rock scene. You know, you got bands like Mudhoney before that Green River. And Green River's a classic example. Stone and Jeff, who went on to form Mother Love Bone and Pearl Jam, they were more in that kind of, not hair metal, but that kind of, that kind of LA scene glam rock way of thinking. Whereas, Steve Turner and Mark Arm were definitely more raw and punk rock. Kurt Cobain would have been into more punk rock, part of all of that. It's such an interesting time, and again, it just informs the eclecticism of the whole scene at the time.
And I have a little pet theory of mine, and it's that we have this era where the biggest stars in music are Kurt Cobain, Eddie Vedder, some of these guys who definitely wanted to be famous, wanted to have successful music careers, but shunned a lot of the extra stuff, right? You have Kurt Cobain talking about how he missed being able to just go into a thrift store and look around because he had gotten too big. And you have Eddie Vedder doing like pirate radio shows where he plays Fugazi and building a wall around his house because somebody tried to crash into it. And
Stalker, yeah.
you have all of these like big stars who are trying to not be big stars. They want their music to be successful, but they don't want the extra stuff. And it feels like the generation that didn't want to be rock stars ended up being the last rock stars because, like you mentioned, when the internet hits, then everybody can listen to their own little niche. So you don't have the water cooler conversations like, oh my God, did you see the Nirvana video last night? When that stops happening, everybody sort of finds their own niches, and it's hard to have big rock stars like Kurt Cobain, Eddie Vedder, Chris Cornell, Lane
Yeah,
Staley.
you're so right. That's so true. That's a good way of looking at it. I mean, they were probably the last rock stars. I mean, the unfortunate thing about that whole scene was the attrition rate. I mean, they're Eddie Vedder's the only guy left. It's a very it was a brutal scene for some reason, but I mean, it gave so much, and there has been nothing like it since. And I do firmly believe, for a few reasons, it was because it was pre-internet. It was slightly different. It came up in a there used to be scenes, the London scene, the Manchester scene, always a scene that hasn't happened since. So it's interesting.
And you would not just open your Spotify and listen to everybody's hits. And nobody was suggesting something to you. There was no algorithm that was saying, oh, you liked X, so you're going to like Y.
Mhm.
You might have had your $20 to buy a record or two every couple of weeks. So you bought Nevermind by Nirvana and you listened to the whole thing because you didn't have an algorithm that let you listen to every band that existed at the time. When you bought that CD, you put on the CD and you listened to the whole thing. And then once you were done, you listened to it again. So
Yeah.
not only were you getting a different kind of music, but you were forced to kind of enjoy the whole album because you might not get another 15 bucks to get another
Exactly.
CD for a couple more weeks.
Exactly. Exactly, yes, and you put a lot more effort into actually learning. But the bands also put more effort into developing an album as something that you would listen to from start to finish. Um, if you think of the albums that were released around that time, even like in the early 90s, they're absolute masterpieces. There is no filler in anything. It's not like they're thinking of these albums as like a single. When you 10 by Pearl Jam, like the big ones, 10 by Pearl Jam, Bad Motorfinger by Soundgarden, Nirvana's Nevermind. These are incredible pieces of art. They don't stop delivering the goods every single time. And like you said, when we were younger, we listened to those things because that's all we had, and information traveled a lot slower, so it was more difficult. And you just listen to that over and over and over till you got the next one, probably a couple of months later.
It was like discovering something. Even when the bands were huge, it still felt like you were a part of it because it was way more tactile than music is now. Like you were touching it, you would hold.
Yes.
I even remember seeing interviews with Eddie Vedder that he was upset that it was a CD and not a vinyl because it just felt like small. But even being able to hold that CD is even better than what kids get today. And I don't want to sound like an old man, and
Yeah.
I like a lot of new music, but I feel like there was something about that experience that was part of why grunge broke. So I don't want to ruin the book for people, and I don't want to blow too many of the albums that you
Hmm.
put on this list, but can you give me one or two surprises, one or two albums that people might not be thinking about? Obviously, I'm sure there's something by Nirvana on there, there's something by Pearl Jam, but what's an album that people might not know that if they want to go try to check it out now would be really worth their time?
Well, since I'm Irish, there's an Irish band in there called Curb Dog. And Curb Dog are a phenomenal band. They're actually friends of mine, which made it easier for me when I was writing the section on Curb Dog because I could talk to them. Um, and Curb Dog are from Kilkenny in Ireland, where I'm right now, and they signed in 1993. They had Tom Zutad, who would have signed Guns N' Roses. He flew from LA. They did their showcase in a small little pub in Kilkenny. And they had all of these record company executives fly in, arrive in Kilkenny in these limousines. And they signed them. And even though they didn't really make it to the States, they went a couple of times. They did some shows over there. They recorded one of their music videos in Chicago. They really did well in Ireland and England. But their first album, which is in the book, is just anybody who's into that scene really needs to listen to that album. It is phenomenal. A bunch of young guys from really, like, as we say, the back arse of nowhere in Kilkenny, putting out this album that I think stands toe to toe with a lot, like the majority of the stuff that was coming out of US at the time. So there's things like that in the book that, if people delve in, they will like it if they like that kind of music at all.
So I'm so glad that you mentioned Curb Dog because that was one of my questions that I was going to have for
Okay.
you a little later. I think, and I believe this is off their second album, if I'm not mistaken, but the song Sally
Oh,
by
it's
Curb
amazing.
Dog, it is one of those songs that just sounds like the perfect grunge song. Like if you were
Yes.
going to write a grunge song, it would sound like Sally. Kind of like in the 80s, if you were going to write a pop rock song, it would be The Outfield Your Love, right? Like
Yes.
that's just the quintessential, perfectly crafted 80s pop rock song. Curb Dog Sally, I think, is that for the 90s grunge scene. And I'm so glad that you mentioned them. They are still out there playing right now, right?
Yes. Yeah, they do shows. They haven't released any new material. I think they're either clever or very, very lazy. It's one or the other, but they've kept the nostalgia of those two albums that they released, and they tour quite a lot, doing shows. So they're phenomenal live. They've still got it. Those songs are just amazing.
So why don't we get into what the grunge scene was like over in Ireland? How did
Yes,
everything break over there? I know that there would have been this common denominator of MTV. So
yeah.
when we saw Smells Like Teen Spirit in the US, you saw it over in Ireland. But were there different bands? Were there different scenes that broke?
Not really. I think there was a lot of commonality, and I think you've hit the nail on the head. MTV was the way we consumed our music, and it was pretty much the same content. Um, but it hit hard. I mean, in Ireland, it was huge. In the UK, it was huge too. But Ireland, I mean, I grew up in that era, and it was everybody my age. It was just huge. We had our own acts other than Curb Dog. Therapy were a huge alternative rock band in Ireland at the time, still playing today, and smaller bands as well. Like, but everybody was inspired by it. I think it's so funny. Like when you see these things, you would think of that time being less connected, but really the commonality was a lot stronger than you would think because we needed that change as much as you know the kids in the US needed that change in music, that reality, and it was all over the world. It hit, like that. Dave Grohl had a really, it's kind of a touching story. It's in the book as well about after Kurt had died, the first place he came to was Ireland because he thought he would just go somewhere that he knew and he could kind of get away. He went down to Kerry to the west of Ireland, and he tells a story that he was driving his car. Kurt was only dead a month less. He's driving his car around the ring of Kerry, and he said it's like you're on another planet. It's like nobody is there. And then all of a sudden he turns around the corner and there's this kid hitching a ride, and he's got a Kurt Cobain t-shirt on.
Oh,
And
wow.
he said when he saw it, he just said, I can never outrun this. I can never, he kind of went back to Dublin then and he made the decision. He wrote This Is a Call, the first song on the Foo Fighters' first album after
Wow.
that. And he made the decision that he was going to carry on. But like it was everywhere here. Very powerful, meant a lot to all the people that were growing up in that time. And I think it's really inspiring sometimes to see that effectively people are the same no matter where you're from. You kind of strive to look for the same thing. And that spark of the grunge and alternative rock scene was really important to teenagers our age.
Kurt Cobain had done an interview where he talked about Nirvana playing a show in Cork. And after the show, he was walking around Cork and he just felt a connection. And
Yeah,
he had assumed that his family came from Cork because of how strong the connection was. Now, people have since done the research, and his family was from a different part of Ireland,
yeah.
but he was able to have that connection. And beyond the bands that were from Ireland, Therapy, Curb Dog, some of the other ones, there definitely was a connection that Kurt Cobain had to Ireland. Were they by far the biggest of the Seattle bands in Ireland? Did that connection sort of transfer over? Or was it kind of like over here where Nirvana and Pearl Jam kind of hit it the hardest, and then Alice in Chains and Soundgarden after that? Like, how did that work?
Yeah, I think you described it probably pretty well the same. Nirvana hit first. Pearl Jam quickly came up behind and really took momentum. I mean, those classic years of Pearl Jam, the 10 and the Versus album, Pearl Jam were untouchable. Pearl Jam came here and played Slane Castle, opening for Neil Young with Van Morrison on the bill and the Saw Doctors. Um,
Wow.
I don't know if you know the Saw Doctors, but they're like kind of I don't know how to describe them, but they're an Irish band, but it's just such a strange lineup. But then you're right, like Alice in Chains just underneath, Soundgarden underneath that, and there was that Nirvana hierarchy. Nirvana were like gods, man. It was like it was just it was something else. But there was always a bit of a darkness around Nirvana sometimes. You would read things in the press, and so people were really kind of they didn't know what was happening there with that thing. But then they would release this brilliant music. It was a strange thing.
You also mentioned that of those four big Seattle bands, and even if you extend it to Stone Temple Pilots being another huge grunge band, obviously not from Seattle, but they were huge, and Eddie Vedder being the only one who still survives. Alice in Chains is still touring with a new lead singer now, and we have Foo Fighters, but now that we've lost Chris Cornell, we lost Lane Staley, and of course, in 1994, we lost Kurt Cobain, we lost Scott Weiland. If you would have looked at it at the time and you would have said that Eddie Vedder was the one who was going to make it out of this, I don't think anybody would have believed you because the fame hit him and Kurt the hardest. And
Yeah.
Pearl Jam made a very deliberate decision to back away after Kurt Cobain passed. And they tried very, very hard to keep their fans, obviously, keep making music and keep the fans they had. But I think they found the real key to longevity where they said, okay, who's our real fan and who's just here for the time being? And now they can play any city in the world, sell out a 25,000 seat arena, but they're not necessarily going to have hits anymore.
Yeah. I think that was a master move, but what a risky move. How they pulled back from the limelight. And here's the funny thing about this. There was an interview with Mark Arm and Steve Turner from Mudhoney, and they had gone on tour with both bands. And they said that the Nirvana camp was a mess. It was so difficult to tour. It was a bad atmosphere, really not a very pleasant thing to do. And then they went on the Pearl Jam tour, and they said it was incredible. Their crew treated them, like they were the headline act. And a lot of people would think like the credibility may have been with Nirvana, but Pearl Jam were as punk as any of them. Because in order to do a thing like that takes balls. I mean, that's the essence of punk. When you've got a major label breathing down your throat, and on your second album, you will not make any music videos. In the MTV age, Nirvana never did a punk move like that. None of them did. It's insane. I mean, like, Pearl Jam get a lot of slack, and it's probably because they're the only ones that are still here. And they've had time to make, mediocre albums and go up and down as a career should. But when you look back on their time, they really, really took some brave decisions.
The question always exists, and it goes back to Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin, and then it goes through to Kurt Cobain. If they would have survived, would they have been playing the state fair? You never know if they would have stayed as big because you can think of bands that were that huge, and then 20 years later, you know, you're seeing them at some ridiculous venue that you never would have thought would have been possible. I do want to get to another Irish band, and this one, not grunge,
Hmm.
certainly, but definitely in the alternative vein. And that is the Cranberries. And I want to talk
Yeah.
just a little bit about them because I think if you talk about just legendary voices and somebody that you can hear that song and pinpoint exactly
Yeah.
who's singing it, who's playing it. I think the Cranberries are one of those bands. Can you talk a little bit about them and the impact they had in Ireland and them as a whole?
Well, you've hit the nail on the head. Dolores was, I mean, she was an icon. Her voice was really key to that band. The band was really great because it did blend a lot of the alternative rock feel at the time, more of the REM type feel, I think. You know, more of the kind of prettier and lighter side that was so great about the alternative rock scene. They did it beautifully, which supported this voice that was like, it's so hard to describe because I can hear her Limerick accent in her voice, and I think to the rest of the world that sounds kind of unique because the Limerick accent is a really unique accent, and she never shied away from just being herself, like both in her personal life and how she sang. It just all came out. She was, when you hear a song like Linger, I mean, who who writes things like that? Like that's got that little kind of gossamer thin guitar part at the start, and then this voice comes in, and the song slowly builds. It's just beautiful. Um, but they were even affected probably by the heaviness and the darkness of the grunge scene because Zombie came out then, and that was sort of a little different for them, and but they attacked that so well. They got and again she was quite diverse. Her voice would do more than you actually would. It would suit certain types of song much better than you would initially think. She was incredible. The band were incredible.
And you can have this disparate vibe to their songs where you have something like Zombie that hits such a difficult topic. And now, all these years later, you'll have a soccer stadium full of people just belt it out on a
Yeah.
whim. And then you get something like Ode to My Family,
Mm.
which, you don't get very many songs in the 90s that are positive about your mother and your father. And there's
Yeah.
just sort of that Irish connection, I think, to the
Yes.
closeness of family in that song. So just so diverse in their offerings. And I think that is something that really doesn't get appreciated.
Absolutely. And I do think, like, I'm not sure of what their individual influences are. I can hear a lot of, like, I don't hear a lot of UK, like, I don't hear much of the Smiths or that in the Cranberries music. I hear more of a transatlantic American type alternative indie type sound in their playing. It would be really interesting to talk to them and find out where those influences were coming from because when it came together and when they had Dolores, I mean it was magic.
So we talk about when did grunge start? And we can basically pinpoint it to Smells Like Teen Spirit. And I think a lot of the time when people try to put the other bookmark there, when they try to end it, they say it was when Kurt died. And I don't
Mm.
think that's necessarily the real end point for grunge. I look at it a little more when those bands like Creed and
Mm.
Nickelback and some of the bands that maybe had a similar sound to the grunge scene, but they didn't bring that same punk rock ethos to it, that they were maybe a little more willing to do the radio interviews. And
Yes.
they were, Nickelback was never going to say, no, I'm not making a music video for
Mm.
MTV. So
Yeah.
I think that a lot of radio stations, MTV in particular, they were getting a little sick of dealing with people like Kurt Cobain, Eddie Vedder,
Yeah.
some of the drug problems with guys like Scott Weiland and Lane Staley. And they're like, here come these bands just from my area, Fuel. And they were a local band to us. And I love them, but they took a lot of that 90s sound. and sort of made it more palatable, and they were a little more willing to cooperate and play the game. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I think you're right. I think people are very quick to say Kurt Cobain's death put a full stop on this whole scene. In certain ways, it may have killed the innocence of it or the joy of it for a lot of the musicians, maybe. It became very stark and sober and real, you know. Uh, but it did continue. I mean, Soundgarden's Super Unknown came out just after Kurt killed himself, and that was their biggest album. So, you know, it did go on, but it started to overlap, as you said, with some stuff that was more palatable. I mean, look, I don't want to sit here and kind of say, you know, Creed is terrible, even though I don't listen to them and I don't like them. You know, they've got their place. People like that stuff. But you hit the nail on the head. I mean, it became easier to deal with these people. They were more open to, and that edge that people craved in the early 90s, that real edge was gone. There is a band in the book that I think kind of straddled that scene in a similar way that Mother Love Bone straddled the scene between glam rock and the kind of more, you know, grunge scene. And that would be a band like Live, because Live's first album, Mental Jewelry, and their second album, Throwing Copper, are absolutely incredible albums in a kind of an REM type vein, slightly more beefed up REM vibe. Now they did start going down. You know, it's funny because they went down the kind of Creed route eventually. You know, but in the early days they did straddle that kind of thing pretty well. And I think Throwing Copper was an incredible album. It came out in 1994 as well. So you know, these transitions are not as quick as we think. They happened slower, and there was definitely bridges to the next one. But yeah, I think you're right. I think the whole scene sort of died in its original form when that stuff started coming in.
It's funny that you mentioned Live. I don't have much more time with you here, but I mentioned that Fuel was from the area where I live. They were from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Live was from
New
about
York.
30 minutes the other direction in York, Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And they both broke at a club called Chameleon Club in Lancaster. It doesn't exist anymore, but it was about, oh, I don't know, a 15-minute drive from my house where I'm sitting
Wow.
talking to you right now. So those bands really do have a big part in my music fandom and the way that I enjoy it. So I just want to take a quick minute here before I let you go. How can people pick up The Year Grunge Broke?
So the book is available in two places that are easiest to get it. The publisher is a UK publishing company called Away with Media, AWAY with Media.com, or the Year Grunge Broke website. So that's the yeargrungebroke.com. And all the links will be there to the book. The book is here. It's quite a tome. It comes in a big heavy slipcase. It's got plectrums. It's got backstage passes. If you ever come to our show, you can use that. You know, and it's very detailed. The foreword is done by David Bruzzese from Pearl Jam, the original Pearl Jam drummer, the guy who did the touring on the 10 album and recorded Vitology and Verses with them. He wrote the foreword for it. And yeah, so that's where you can pick it up.
Clive Barnes, thank you so much for joining us.
This has been great, and thank you so much for having me.